I love The Legend of Zelda. Actually, love isn't quite the right word. Let me rephrase that. I adore The Legend of Zelda. It's my favorite series of all time. The games are consistently some of my most replayed, even the ones that I never particularly cared for. Something about the way the games challenge you to navigate and learn about the worlds and mechanics was fascinating, not to mention the softer elements like the story, characters, and atmosphere. So you can imagine a 15-year-old me, a sophomore in high school, waiting for the day the Switch released so I could start begging my mom to buy one with a new Zelda, because I didn't want to play on my stinky Wii U. I ended up having to wait an agonizing 10 months for it, playing a tiny bit on a friend's Switch during English class and having to narrowly avoid spoilers during my first summer job. Then, on Christmas of 2017, I finally got my Switch and a copy of Breath of the Wild. I pop it in, spend the next month or so playing it, and I thought it was okay. I didn't hate it, I certainly didn't love it. I was somewhere between lukewarm and mildly positive on it. I enjoyed my time with it, but more often than not I ended up feeling like there was just about to be something really good over the horizon, and that just never happened. I certainly disagreed with everyone who was calling this the best Zelda ever, but it didn't really bother me all too much and I just went back to playing the classic-styled games. Eventually, once I got the DLC, I started a new game and my opinion started to sour a bit. I had done everything before. I knew the story, I knew where all the cool things to collect were, and most importantly, I already knew just how much of the map had nothing in it. By now, I could definitively rank it on the lower half of the series, but I could still see myself having fun with it. Then a few years later, I tried a third time just to see if maybe my opinion had changed. I even went out of my way to complete all 136 shrines, since those were the parts of the game that I remember enjoying the most. The entire playthrough was spent with me pleading for the game to give me something, anything fun to do, and being met with a silent no nearly every time. By now I had started playing other open worlds, and every time I collected another worthless Korok seed or reached another interesting looking structure only for it to have absolutely nothing, I just felt like I was wasting my time. The game was firmly my least favorite Zelda, but at the very least it was getting a sequel, and there was no way it wasn't going to at least address some of the more pressing issues of Breath of the Wild. Then Tears of the Kingdom released, and now I'm making this video well over a year later. I should first clarify that I do believe that the older Zeldas are better. Not these older Zeldas, but these older Zeldas. I don't dislike the games that follow Majora's Mask, but with only one or two exceptions, I vastly prefer the first 6 games to anything that came after them. These are all in my top 10, and 4 of them are in my top 5. After that, the games seem to have less nuance in their design, less complexity, less incentive to actually utilize their mechanics in a creative and meaningful way. None of them ever got anywhere near as bad as the modern games, but they still never reached the high points of the series. I know this all sounds like it's coming from some old boomer that hated every Zelda he didn't grow up with, but I was born in 2001, I didn't play Zelda until high school, and my first Zelda was Wind Waker HD, so I feel like I've earned the right to say that it's nowhere near as good as Ocarina of Time. Maybe someday I'll make other videos detailing my thoughts on the individual games, because believe me, I have a lot to say about all of them, and not all of it is a popular opinion. But for now, you should know that I think that Zelda had been on a bit of a downward curve for a while at this point. This is all just to say that the old style of Zelda didn't inherently make the games good, and the lack of adhering to that style isn't what makes the new games bad. Yes, I would have preferred if the series stuck to what it was instead of chasing what it wasn't, and I think that the new games being bad is a direct result of a misguided attempt to be different for the sake of being different, but the new games are bad regardless of the fact that they're such a departure from the norm, not just because of it. So how exactly are they bad? Well, let's take it one game at a time. For the sake of the argument, I'm only planning on discussing games that released after 2011 because I think that's when the new direction of the series truly started. Also, I'm not going to be discussing spin-offs at all, and that includes Triforce Heroes. Yes, the multiplayer games are spin-offs. I don't care if they're canon or say The Legend of Zelda on the box. They are fundamentally different from any other game in the series, and literally nobody thinks of them as a replacement for the real thing the same way they do with Breath of the Wild. With that, let's take a look at the first Zelda to truly break the mold and stick it to that gross, icky formula, A Link Between Worlds. I want to say that A Link Between Worlds is generally considered the best of the handheld Zeldas apart from maybe Link's Awakening, and to tell the truth, I don't hate it. In fact, I actually prefer it to one or two of the classic-style Zeldas. That doesn't mean it's good, though. This is also the only game I wanted to talk about in the series that I legitimately had to replay since it's actually been a while since I last tried it. I didn't know what I was going to do if the game I started this series on turned out to become a new favorite of mine, but luckily my opinion remained one of indifference. So let's get this out of the way. A Link Between Worlds has a ton of gimmicks, and arguably the most prominent one is that the map uses the same general layout as A Link to the Past. On one hand, unlike a certain Switch game, A Link Between Worlds was released 20 years after the game it's based on, and as such was completely recreated from scratch rather than just using the same models and engine. It used the same basic layout as a template, so I don't feel nearly as annoyed over it. On the other hand, I've played A Link to the Past before. Many times over. The reuse of the overworld, among other things, just forced me to draw comparisons to that game, and spoiler alert, most of those comparisons end up being in its favor, not A Link Between Worlds. Also, I would be remiss if I didn't at least mention that this isn't the first time a sequel to A Link to the Past does something like this. While Link's Awakening doesn't take place in Hyrule, its map reuses a ton of elements from A Link to the Past's version of Hyrule. The main town to the center left with the spooky woods above it, the big castle in the center, the lake below the castle, ruins to the east with a big waterfall area above it, the mountain range on the top of the map with a big tower on one side of it. Even some of the Dark World elements make it in, like Turtle Rock being on the other side of the mountain range from the tower. Clearly it's not anywhere close to being identical, but it's obvious that they were trying to carry over a lot from its predecessor, probably on account of the fact that it was originally going to be a demake of A Link to the Past before they decided to make it its own thing. Similarly, A Link Between Worlds was originally going to be a remake of A Link to the Past, but while Link's Awakening used the similarities to A Link to the Past to its advantage by heavily implying that the dream world was constructed from Link's own memories of his time in Hyrule, A Link Between Worlds really doesn't do a whole lot with the concept of being a sequel to A Link to the Past beyond just being A Link to the Past again. I mean, there's a short section at the very beginning of the game where you're forced to read a very truncated recap of A Link to the Past that even kind of references Ocarina of Time, and they do make reference to the fact that the events of the game are similar to those of A Link to the Past, but that's about as far as it goes narratively. Heck, it even contradicts A Link to the Past by having the descendants of the Seven Maidens include the Queen of the Zoras but not Zelda herself for some reason. It's even worse once you get to Lorule, this game's alternate version of Hyrule. It's technically supposed to be a different world from the Dark World, but every single aspect about it is identical for some unexplained reason down to the names of the individual locations. The only major change is that Turtle Rock and Ice Palace have swapped places, which somehow makes even less sense than if they didn't. While I don't think reusing A Link to the Past's layout ruined A Link Between Worlds, I do think that it's to the game's detriment overall, and ultimately makes the game feel like it's pandering to the people who grew up with A Link to the Past more than trying to have an identity of its own. I also think that it's odd that one of the biggest talking points about Skyward Sword nowadays is the idea that people were growing tired of the series formula, only for the next game to literally be a quasi-remake of the game that's commonly cited as inventing the formula in the first place and being praised for it. It's almost like nobody actually had an issue with the Zelda formula until Breath of the Wild released, and this entire talking point against Skyward Sword is a complete lie made to justify the shift in direction, but that's a discussion for another video. Reusing A Link to the Past's overworld might be the most noticeable gimmick, but wall merging is the one that's most prominently featured in the game's marketing. It's alright. I like the concept, but they don't really do a whole lot with it beyond now you could slip through cracks and cross a gap between two platforms. There were some times where I had to think pretty hard about where I was supposed to go with it, but more often than not it just kind of felt like the only reason why that challenge existed was because the perspective of the camera made it hard to tell what elevation I was on or obscured some obstacle that I couldn't pass. It ultimately just makes me wish that they saved this idea for a 3D game where spatial awareness is a concept that's a lot easier to design around, and even then, I'm not 100% sure that it would be wise to rely on that as the game's biggest gimmick. I don't really have much else to say about it, it's just kinda okay. Another big change to the mechanics is energy. It's kinda similar to how Skyward Sword replaced magic with stamina, only this time instead of being tied to things like sprinting, climbing, and spin attacks, it ties directly to the items you use and nothing else. I don't hate this concept in theory. I think the idea behind it is that they recognized how little things like magic, bomb, and arrow limits were affecting the actual difficulty of the game, so they replace it with a system that still limits how much these items can be used, and yeah, I don't blame them. I'll delve into this concept a bit more when I talk about Breath of the Wild, but in my personal experience it is very hard to run out of things in basically any of the games after Zelda 2, so replacing the resource management mechanics outright isn't a bad idea. The problem is that it's not particularly well implemented here. I think the biggest sticking point is the fact that this energy meter doesn't just apply to bombs and arrows, it applies to everything, and most of those are things that it really shouldn't. Sure, the fire and ice rods make sense, and I could see an argument being made for the sand and tornado rods making sense in universe, but why do the hammer, hookshot, and boomerang need them? These items have never required a resource in any of the games they've appeared in before, and it's not like they made them so much better in this game to compensate. Heck, even disregarding the energy requirement, the hammer is still worse in A Link Between Worlds, even though all the damage values are the exact same as they are in A Link to the Past, since it now has a longer startup animation, so why require energy on top of that? A core element to what makes a good item in Zelda is how good it is outside of the puzzles it's required in, through combat or other utility, and the value of these items is significantly diminished by this. The most aggravating one to me is wall merging. I can at least understand wanting to put a limit on combat items, but why do I need to use this limited resource just to engage with the game's main puzzle-solving gimmick? It's not like the game ever uses the energy requirement as an element in puzzles, and even if it did, they put instant refills next to nearly every puzzle in the game. There's one other gimmick in this game, and it's by far the one I have the most to say about. I hate item rental. I really hate item rental. I hate it more than every single gimmick in the series combined. I hate it more than weapon durability. I hate it more than Ultra Hand. I hate it more than the Triforce quest, Kinstones, Temple of the Ocean King, motion and touch controls, you name it. All of these may have been poorly implemented or unnecessary or annoying, but none of them inherently break the core gameplay loop of the series like item rental does. I'm not even entirely sure where to begin with why this is such a bad gimmick. So for those of you who have never played A Link Between Worlds, you don't get your items out of dungeons in this game. The dungeons are still there, the items are still there, you still need the items in the respective dungeons, but instead of getting the items out of said dungeons, you rent them from a shop with rupees. Even on a surface level, this feels lame. No more excitement as you wonder what items each dungeon might hold. Now every single item you will ever be using across the entire game is right there. See this? This is it. It certainly doesn't help that all but 2 of these items are ripped straight from A Link to the Past, with the remaining items either being a worse version of an item from Spirit Tracks or just lame in general. So already item rental is looking bad, but don't worry, it gets worse. You can either rent items or buy them. When you rent them, you're allowed to keep them until the next time you die. Granted, the game isn't particularly difficult, so it's very rare for anyone to ever lose their items, but the developers knew that this was annoying regardless, so they let you buy them instead for a hefty price. And I mean hefty. The bare minimum amount of rupees required to buy all of the items is 7,400. You need these items too, but the developers have no way of knowing whether or not the player is going to spend their money on items or waste them all on scoot fruit or whatever, so to compensate, the developers are constantly giving you rupees for every little thing. Not just small rupees either, big ones. It's not uncommon to find a chest in the overworld and have it contain 100 or even 300 rupees. The game even realizes this since it gives you a high score counter every single time you beat the game. Hyrule's economy is so inflated with rupees that any competent or thorough player is practically guaranteed to have enough money to buy every single item in the game by the time they finish their 5th dungeon, and there are 12 dungeons in this game. Not only does this negatively affect the story, since the shopkeeper Ravio is an integral part of the game's finale after you forgot he even existed for the past 5 hours, but once you get all of the items, there's barely anything to ever spend them on afterwards. It wouldn't even be that big of an issue if only the game would stop giving me rupees for every single thing I do, because now it just feels like the effort I spent doing the side quest or figuring out how to reach that chest was for nothing. Sounds pretty bad, right? Don't worry, it gets worse. By far the thing that annoys me the most about item rental is how it affects the dungeons themselves. Let me explain to you how a typical classic puzzle box dungeon in Zelda works. I'll use the Forbidden Woods from Wind Waker as an example, not because I think it's an exceptional dungeon, but because I think it does a good job of showing the standard formula for a dungeon without going much further than that. Step 1. The player enters the dungeon. This will often require you to use an item you've obtained previously that will play a heavy role in the coming dungeon. In this case, we need to use the Deku Leaf that we just obtained a few minutes ago to fly across the ocean to the dungeon, but it can also be an item that we've had for a while, like the hookshot for the Water Temple in Ocarina of Time. Step 2. The first few rooms contain a puzzle involving a new mechanic. In this case, this vine is blocking our access to the door and closes its eye if we get close, forcing us to use a projectile of some sort to kill it. We don't have anything in our inventory that will work, so our only option is to throw this giant seed growing in the corner. Step 3. The next few rooms add another new mechanic or bring back an old one. The Forbidden Forest introduces these platforms that move back and forth depending on the direction you use the Deku Leaf in. This first one is pretty simplistic, but it doesn't need to be anything more than that as long as it does a good job of showing the player how it works. Step 4. The dungeon combines the two mechanics. The very next room we get to the other side only to realize that there's another vine blocking the door. We look around for a seed only to see that one is on the other side of the room and the only way to reach it is by using another moving platform like the one before. So we ride the platform to the other side, set the nut on the platform, and move back across. Steps 3 and 4 can be repeated a few times. In this case, the game shows us that our gusts can break seeds from their stems in the next room. It's also important to note that not every room in the dungeon needs to add to this evolution of puzzles. In fact, every dungeon should have a few rooms where the puzzles do their own thing or where the only obstacles are enemies to fight. Step 5. The player obtains a new item. This is the most important part. The player enters a room and will usually have to fight a mini-boss of some sort. This mini-boss can utilize the mechanics of the dungeon in some way, or just be a test of the player's combat skills that happens to be contextually themed to the dungeon. In our case, Mothula here is the latter. After defeating the mini-boss, the game then gives the player an item with a unique function. The game usually tests the player's understanding of this function in order to leave the room or very shortly after. Here we get the boomerang and are told that it can hit up to 5 targets that we select by hovering our reticle over one. We then have to use the boomerang to hit these 2 switches above the door at the same time. Step 6. The item is used to solve a variation of an older puzzle. This is pretty self-explanatory. As soon as we exit the room we got the boomerang in, we see another door with another vine on it, this time with 2 eyes. If we hit one of the eyes, it quickly grows back, so we use what we learned to hit both at once with the boomerang. Step 7. We learn a new mechanic that can only be solved with a new item. Here we see a room with a gap that we need to cross, but if we try to glide across with a Deku Leaf, we're stopped by these vines. Most players by now will recognize that the solution probably involves the item we just got and use the boomerang to clear a path. If you want to do something really interesting, put another puzzle in this room that the player has visited before and have the layout loop around. The player will most likely recognize that there's an obstacle on their first visit that they can't overcome and wonder what the potential solution to the puzzle will be. When they finally get back, they'll not only have the tools to solve the puzzle, but they'll also have the experience needed to recognize what the solution is. Here we have a giant flower suspended by 5 vines. We obviously knew that this flower had something to it when we first visited this room, but only now do we know exactly what that process is. Step 8. Make progressively harder puzzles combining elements from previous puzzles in the dungeon. Once again, this is pretty self-explanatory. The Forbidden Forest does this by having the player cut down another flower and using it as a raft to float across the river, hit these switches in such a way that the boomerang isn't blocked by this tree, and even making the player drop a bomb through a hole from one of the platforms from earlier to get an optional treasure chart. This is an early game dungeon from Wind Waker, so it's not going to be particularly difficult, but it still evolves the mechanics. Step 9. Boss. The boss is generally a continuation of Step 8, only this time it's the finale of everything the dungeon has been leading up to. It doesn't typically use all of the ideas in a dungeon, but it does usually evolve 1 or 2 of them while also testing the player's ability to recognize and utilize those mechanics while under the pressure of being in a fight. Fighting Kale Demos involves cutting the vines that hold it up to the ceiling quickly enough so that they can't grow back in time to make its weak point vulnerable. You can use the boomerang to cut them 5 at a time, but a skilled player will remember the fact that the boomerang has an arc from earlier and spread out the targeted vines in such a way that they can cut a bunch of them at once. After the boss is killed, the player celebrates their victory with a heart container and leaves the dungeon with their new toy in tow. I should clarify that this formula isn't set in stone. There are plenty of dungeons that effectively play around with the process, but usually they do it in ways that compensate for the deviation. The Shadow Temple gives you the hover boots really early on into the dungeon because most of the mechanics that it uses are something that the player learned in Bottom of the Well already. The bosses in Majora's Mask barely use the dungeon items at all, but they do heavily utilize the transformation masks that the player got directly before the dungeon. I get tired of the common talking point that formulas are this thing that should be broken just for being used too frequently. A formula isn't a restriction, it's a tool. A tool that can, has, and should be utilized to do great things. This tool in particular is an excellent way to explore new ideas and mechanics in a controlled environment before letting the player loose on the rest of the game. So what does this have to do with item rental? Well, let's take a look at how A Link Between Worlds makes dungeons. Step 1. The player enters the dungeon. Let's use Turtle Rock as an example. The player needs the ice rod to freeze this lava plume so they can cross the lava to the dungeon's entrance. Up until now, this will be the very first time the ice rod is required for the vast majority of players. In fact, I struggle to remember a single other point where it could possibly be required beforehand. Step 2. Introduce a new mechanic. Here we see the dungeon introduce a new mechanic, this time these seesaws that freeze in place if you hit them with the ice rod. You have to freeze this one in order to get to the path above it. This is the extent of the mechanic. There are exactly 6 of these seesaws throughout the entire dungeon, 3 of which being in this very room. They are never once used in any new or interesting ways. This is it. Step 3. Do Step 2 a few more times. We see Turtle Rock introduce 2 other ideas. The first is the concept of hitting something on a platform above Link with the ice rod, since it works by spawning a chunk of ice in the air that falls down. This is used exactly twice. The other is this tile that warps the player to another room in the dungeon, which is a concept ripped straight from A Link to the Past. This isn't the only dungeon in A Link Between Worlds that uses them, but it is the only one to heavily feature them as a major gimmick. I call them a major gimmick, but like everything else, they only appear a handful of times and they don't really do anything with it. I guess it's kind of confusing to keep track of where they go, but that's it. Step 4. I don't know. This is where the dungeon completely falls apart. You'll notice that I basically had the same thing to say about all of these mechanics, that all of them are rarely used. That's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, those moving platforms in the Forbidden Forest are only used 3 times, but all 3 of those uses iterate on the mechanic in some way while also combining it with a different mechanic. Apart from the very last room before the boss of the dungeon where you have to use the ice rod to make a platform in the lava to hit this switch from, these 4 mechanics are never combined together to do anything new. The only other thing to do in this dungeon is find optional chests, most of which are just found by killing all the enemies in a room or merging on the wall. Since the mechanics don't build off of one another at all, there's rarely anything for the boss to ever play off of. Turtle Rock's boss requires you to wait for it to swim under these holes to hit it with the ice rod, which in addition to not being a particularly complex or interesting gimmick, it's also something that the dungeon never even hints at building to. The rest of the boss just involves hitting it with the sword a few times. The entire dungeon can be finished in less than 15 minutes, and not only is this one of the low-rule dungeons which are supposed to be harder, but the game also incentivizes the player to do this towards the end since the ice rod is tied for the most expensive item in the shop. This is a late-game dungeon that struggles to be as complex or interesting as the very first dungeon in most other Zeldas. Granted, this is one of the more severe examples, but even the dungeons that have cool concepts behind them like Dark Palace are way too short and never feel like they're allowed to fully develop their ideas at all. Eventually, some of the concepts are expanded upon in Lorule Castle, but that's something that most other Zeldas do anyway and doesn't make the dungeons that they originate from any better, it just makes Lorule Castle one of the only memorable parts of the game. The before and after of having a dungeon item was such a vital tool for developing the dungeons that removing it from the experience leaves a void that A Link Between Worlds never fills. I'm not saying that it's impossible to remove the item from a dungeon and have it work, but usually when they did that in previous games there was something else to make up for it. To make matters worse, since the player can lose items, the developers have no way of knowing which items the player will have at any given time. They can't risk requiring any item that isn't tied to the dungeon because then a decent portion of the player base will not have it. Because of that, each and every item is almost completely worthless outside of their respective dungeons. Everyone loves complaining about how some of the later classic Zeldas do a bad job of utilizing their items outside of their respective dungeons, but at least with those games it's usually only a problem with a handful of items. In A Link Between Worlds, every item but the lamp is like this because each item necessarily has to be designed like this. At best, there's an occasional cave with a puzzle requiring one of the items, but all that ever leads to is even more money. Now, am I saying that these dungeons are some of the worst things in the series? No. There are a lot of great ideas in these dungeons. I like the darkened desert palaces especially. Heck, for what it's worth, I think that playing through these dungeons is a more pleasant experience than the ones in A Link to the Past, if only because this abomination of a dungeon has been lobotomized. The problem is that while these dungeons might not be aggravating or tedious, they are boring and forgettable, which I think is much, much worse. The most memorable thing about this game wasn't the dungeons, but the act of getting to the dungeons by exploring the overworld, and that really isn't a compliment towards A Link Between Worlds now, is it? And that's just the thing. I have to fall back on the fact that A Link Between Worlds reuses A Link to the Past overworld because this entire game has very little identity of its own beyond that. No other sequel in the series tries so hard to remind you of the game it's based on, especially not while removing a core aspect of what made that original game so great to begin with. Even Twilight Princess, a game that exists for the sole purpose of catering to the people who liked Ocarina of Time more than Wind Waker, still has a completely unique world, story, mechanics, art style, you name it. Looking at it contemporarily, it fares even worse since the few things it did change would go on to be the basis for everything modern Zelda prides itself on. The common opinion on this game is that it should be looked to as the perfect middle ground between the classic style of Zelda and the new style, but regardless of my thoughts on modern Zelda as a whole, the unfortunate truth is I don't think the two styles are compatible.